Welcome to Framework, the podcast that makes the NIST cybersecurity framework practical, engaging, and accessible. Whether you're a cybersecurity professional, business leader, or simply curious about how organizations defend against cyber threats, this series is for you. This podcast is inspired by a comprehensive guide to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0, a best-selling resource written by cybersecurity expert Dr. Jason Edwards and trusted by professionals worldwide. In each episode, we'll leverage a few insights from Jason's extensive book to dive deep into CSF 2.0, unpacking every function, category, and subcategory with real-world applications you can immediately use. If you're enjoying this episode and want to learn more, head over to cyberauthor.me to grab your copy of the book and access additional resources to enhance your cybersecurity journey. You can also visit baremetalcyber.com, where over 2 million people last year explored expert insights, articles, and practical tools across a wide range of cybersecurity topics. GV.SC-09, Monitoring Supply Chain Security Practices. GV.SC-09 ensures that organizations continuously assess and monitor supplier security practices, ensuring that third-party cybersecurity compliance remains enforced and supply chain risks are dynamically managed. This subcategory belongs to the govern function within the National Institute of Standards and Technology Cybersecurity Framework, version 2.0, emphasizing that ongoing supply chain security monitoring is essential to identifying vulnerabilities, preventing third-party security breaches, and ensuring vendors adhere to cybersecurity best practices. Without structured supplier security monitoring, organizations risk overlooking supply chain security gaps, allowing vendor security weaknesses to persist and facing increased exposure to third-party cyber threats. By implementing structured supply chain security monitoring, organizations ensure that vendor security performance is continuously evaluated, third-party risk assessments remain updated, and supply chain security governance is actively enforced. A structured approach to supplier security monitoring allows organizations to detect emerging cybersecurity risks, enforce compliance measures dynamically, and strengthen third-party security accountability. Organizations that deploy real-time supplier security monitoring tools, enforce periodic third-party security compliance audits, and integrate vendor cybersecurity performance tracking into enterprise security governance strategies, improve their ability to identify, prevent, and mitigate supply chain cyber risks effectively. Multiple stakeholders play a role in monitoring supply chain security practices. Cybersecurity and risk management teams are responsible for tracking vendor security performance, conducting periodic third-party security audits, and enforcing supplier compliance verification measures. Procurement and vendor management teams ensure that supplier security monitoring obligations are included in procurement agreements, requiring vendors to participate in structured cybersecurity compliance evaluations. Legal and compliance officers ensure that supply chain security monitoring aligns with contractual security obligations, regulatory requirements, and industry cybersecurity frameworks, reducing exposure to vendor compliance violations. Supply chain security monitoring is implemented through automated third-party cybersecurity risk tracking tools, continuous supplier security assessment frameworks, and dynamic vendor compliance enforcement strategies. This includes deploying AI-driven supply chain risk intelligence platforms, conducting third-party security audits at scheduled intervals, and requiring suppliers to submit real-time cybersecurity performance reports. Organizations that fail to monitor supply chain security practices continuously risk allowing undetected security vulnerabilities to persist, facing third-party regulatory compliance failures, and being unprepared for evolving vendor security threats. Several key terms define supply chain security monitoring and its role in cybersecurity governance. Continuous supplier security assessment ensures that organizations regularly evaluate vendor security performance, identifying new vulnerabilities and enforcing compliance measures. Automated third-party risk monitoring enables organizations to track vendor cybersecurity risks in real time, ensuring continuous supplier security oversight. Vendor compliance verification mechanisms ensure that suppliers adhere to structured security governance models, meeting predefined cybersecurity standards. Regulatory compliance audits for vendors require organizations to align supplier security monitoring with industry cybersecurity laws, ensuring legal and contractual adherence. Supply chain security intelligence platforms provide organizations with real-time supplier risk insights, allowing proactive detection and mitigation of third-party cyber threats. Challenges in monitoring supply chain security practices often lead to incomplete supplier security oversight, weak enforcement of vendor security compliance, and failure to integrate supply chain risk monitoring into enterprise security strategies. One common issue is lack of real-time visibility into supplier security risks, where organizations fail to track vendor security compliance dynamically, leading to delayed detection of third-party vulnerabilities. Another issue is inconsistent supplier security monitoring enforcement, where organizations apply strict security oversight to some vendors while allowing others to operate with minimal cybersecurity scrutiny, creating gaps in supply chain security resilience. Some organizations mistakenly believe that supplier security monitoring is only necessary for high-risk vendors, without recognizing that all suppliers, regardless of size or risk category, can introduce cybersecurity threats that impact enterprise security resilience. When organizations implement structured supply chain security monitoring, they enhance supply chain resilience, improve vendor cybersecurity compliance, and ensure that third-party cybersecurity risks are dynamically mitigated. A structured supply chain security monitoring framework ensures that vendor security assessments remain updated, supplier security performance is tracked in real time, and third-party cybersecurity governance remains aligned with enterprise cybersecurity risk management strategies. Organizations that implement continuous supplier security monitoring, enforce periodic vendor risk reassessments, and integrate third-party security compliance tracking into enterprise security governance develop a comprehensive supply chain security strategy that strengthens vendor security resilience and reduces third-party cyber risks proactively. Organizations that fail to monitor supply chain security practices face significant cybersecurity, operational, and compliance risks. Without structured monitoring frameworks, businesses risk allowing vendor security weaknesses to persist, leading to supply chain-wide vulnerabilities, regulatory non-compliance, and operational disruptions caused by third-party cyber threats. A common issue is relying on outdated supplier security assessments, where organizations conduct one-time security evaluations during vendor onboarding, but fail to reassess supplier security risks regularly, leading to undetected vulnerabilities. Another major challenge is failure to enforce consistent security monitoring across all vendors, where some suppliers undergo rigorous security evaluations while others are left unchecked, creating weak links in supply chain cybersecurity governance. By implementing structured supply chain security monitoring, organizations ensure that supplier security risks are continuously identified, vendor compliance remains actively enforced, and third-party cybersecurity oversight remains aligned with enterprise security strategies. A well-defined supplier security monitoring framework enhances visibility into vendor security performance, ensures proactive detection of third-party cybersecurity risks, and enables organizations to mitigate vendor security incidents effectively. Organizations that establish structured supplier security assessment methodologies, enforce real-time vendor security monitoring measures, and integrate third-party security risk tracking into enterprise cybersecurity governance strategies improve their ability to detect, prevent, and mitigate supply chain cyber threats efficiently. At the partial tier, organizations lack formal supply chain security monitoring frameworks, leading to unstructured vendor security oversight, inconsistent supplier security compliance verification, and weak integration of supplier risk tracking into enterprise cybersecurity governance. Supplier security monitoring is handled reactively, with organizations only reviewing vendor security risks after a cybersecurity incident occurs. A small business at this level may rely on cloud service providers, logistics vendors, or outsourced IT service providers without continuously monitoring their cybersecurity compliance, increasing exposure to third-party security failures. At the risk-informed tier, organizations begin to develop structured supplier security monitoring frameworks, ensuring that third-party cybersecurity risks are reassessed at predefined intervals. However, supplier security monitoring efforts may still be limited, with inconsistent application of third-party security oversight across different vendor categories. A mid-size healthcare provider at this level may require software vendors handling patient records to complete annual security audits, but fail to apply the same level of security monitoring to supply chain logistics vendors, creating potential security gaps. At the repeatable tier, organizations implement a fully structured supply chain security monitoring framework, ensuring that supplier cybersecurity assessments are standardized, vendor security performance is continuously evaluated, and third-party security compliance remains actively enforced. Supplier security governance is formalized, with leadership actively involved in reviewing supplier security performance and ensuring that vendor security monitoring remains aligned with enterprise cybersecurity governance strategies. A global financial institution at this stage may require all third-party banking technology providers, cloud service vendors, and payment processors to participate in continuous security compliance verification, ensuring that supplier security risks are proactively managed. At the adaptive tier, organizations employ AI-driven supplier cybersecurity risk intelligence platforms, predictive third-party security compliance tracking tools, and automated vendor risk assessment solutions to dynamically monitor supply chain security performance and ensure real-time vendor security compliance verification. Supplier security monitoring is fully integrated into enterprise cybersecurity governance, ensuring that vendor security compliance tracking, supplier risk reassessments, and third-party cybersecurity governance remain continuously optimized. A multinational defense contractor at this level may use AI-powered supply chain security analytics to assess vendor cybersecurity maturity, enforce automated third-party compliance verification, and dynamically adjust supplier security monitoring protocols based on emerging security threats. Monitoring supply chain security practices aligns with multiple controls in the National Institute of Standards and Technology, Special Publication 800-53, ensuring that organizations implement structured supplier security monitoring frameworks and dynamic third-party cybersecurity compliance enforcement models. One key control is SA-12 Supply Chain Risk Management, which requires organizations to establish structured supplier security monitoring policies, ensuring that vendor security risks are continuously assessed and managed proactively. A global logistics company implementing this control may require all transportation service providers and supply chain logistics vendors to adhere to structured cybersecurity monitoring requirements, ensuring compliance with industry security standards. Another key control is SR-6, Supplier Security Requirements, which mandates that organizations define structured vendor security monitoring obligations, ensuring that third-party cybersecurity compliance remains actively enforced throughout vendor relationships. A financial services firm implementing this control may develop an AI-driven third-party security monitoring platform, enabling continuous vendor risk assessment and dynamic supplier security compliance tracking. Monitoring supply chain security practices also aligns with CA-7 continuous monitoring, which requires organizations to implement real-time security monitoring frameworks, ensuring that supplier cybersecurity risks are dynamically assessed and emerging third-party threats are detected proactively. This control ensures that organizations maintain visibility into supplier security compliance, allowing them to identify vulnerabilities and enforce remediation measures before security incidents escalate. A multinational pharmaceutical company implementing this control may establish continuous vendor security tracking, requiring third-party manufacturing partners and cloud-based data storage providers to submit periodic security compliance reports and undergo real-time security monitoring. These controls can be adapted based on organizational size, industry, and cybersecurity maturity. A small business may implement basic supplier security monitoring processes, ensuring that vendors handling customer data or IT infrastructure complete annual security assessments and provide updated compliance documentation. A large enterprise may deploy AI-powered third-party cybersecurity risk intelligence platforms, automated supplier compliance tracking tools, and predictive vendor security analytics solutions to ensure that supply chain security enforcement dynamically evolves based on real-time threat intelligence and vendor risk profiles. Organizations in highly regulated industries such as finance, healthcare, and government contracting may require continuous supplier security monitoring, executive-led vendor risk management oversight, and legally mandated third-party security compliance benchmarking to ensure supplier cybersecurity monitoring aligns with regulatory requirements. Auditors assess supply chain security monitoring practices by reviewing whether organizations have structured, documented, and continuously enforced supplier cybersecurity risk assessment frameworks. They evaluate whether organizations implement structured vendor security monitoring models, enforce third-party cybersecurity compliance tracking, and integrate supplier risk reassessment processes into enterprise-wide cybersecurity governance strategies. If an organization fails to monitor supply chain security practices effectively, auditors may issue findings highlighting gaps in vendor cybersecurity oversight, weak supplier compliance enforcement, and failure to align third-party security monitoring with enterprise cybersecurity risk management strategies. To verify compliance, auditors seek specific types of evidence. Supplier security assessment reports and structured vendor cybersecurity monitoring documentation demonstrate that organizations formally define and enforce structured supplier security governance models. Third-party cybersecurity compliance tracking records and supplier security audit reports provide insights into whether organizations proactively monitor vendor cybersecurity performance and refine supplier security policies based on real-time security risk intelligence. Incident response evaluations related to supplier security failures and third-party risk mitigation reports show whether organizations effectively track vendor cybersecurity risks, ensuring that supplier security compliance remains continuously enforced. A compliance success scenario could involve a global energy provider that undergoes an audit and provides evidence that supplier security monitoring processes are fully integrated into procurement and vendor management workflows, ensuring that vendor security risks are continuously evaluated, third-party cybersecurity compliance frameworks are actively enforced, and supplier security governance remains aligned with regulatory security standards. Auditors confirm that third-party security risks are systematically managed, vendor cybersecurity compliance is continuously enforced, and supplier security monitoring aligns with enterprise cybersecurity risk governance strategies. In contrast, an organization that fails to implement structured supplier security monitoring frameworks, neglects vendor cybersecurity compliance verification, or lacks formalized third-party security oversight models may receive audit findings for poor supplier risk management, weak third-party cybersecurity monitoring enforcement, and failure to integrate vendor security risk assessments into enterprise security strategies. Organizations face multiple barriers in ensuring that supplier security monitoring remains continuous and effective. One major challenge is lack of automation in vendor cybersecurity tracking, where organizations fail to implement real-time supplier security monitoring tools, leading to delayed detection of third-party security risks. Another challenge is failure to align supplier security monitoring with regulatory compliance requirements, where organizations lack predefined third-party security compliance tracking mechanisms, increasing exposure to legal and financial penalties. A final challenge is over-reliance on vendor self-assessments, where organizations accept supplier security attestations without conducting independent third-party cybersecurity risk evaluations, increasing the risk of unverified cybersecurity vulnerabilities within vendor networks. Organizations can overcome these barriers by developing structured supplier security monitoring frameworks, ensuring that vendor cybersecurity compliance tracking remains continuously enforced, and integrating supplier security risk assessments into enterprise-wide cybersecurity governance strategies. Investing in automated vendor cybersecurity compliance monitoring platforms, predictive supplier security risk assessment models, and AI-driven supplier security performance tracking tools ensures that organizations dynamically assess, monitor, and refine supplier security monitoring strategies in real time. Standardizing supplier cybersecurity governance methodologies across departments, subsidiaries, and external business partners ensures that vendor security policies are consistently applied, reducing exposure to third-party cyber threats and strengthening enterprise-wide supply chain security resilience. By embedding supplier security monitoring practices into enterprise cybersecurity governance strategies, organizations enhance vendor security accountability, improve regulatory compliance, and ensure sustainable supplier risk management strategies across evolving cybersecurity landscapes. That wraps up today's discussion on framework. Don't stop here. Head over to cyberauthor.me to explore more cybersecurity topics and discover a best-selling book covering NIST and other critical cyber frameworks. Please like, rate, and review this episode on Apple and Spotify. Until next time, remember that knowledge is power.